Now let's talk about two entities that are directly involved in carrier management and PortaBilling system. The first one is the vendor entity. This is basically a representation of another operator in our PortaSwitch. One of the goals of this entity is to represent the network configurations of how the calls are terminated to this operator. In case of incoming calls, we also need to let the system know that the call was received from this particular operator or our vendor. Okay? For this, we need a set of technical parameters. We need, of course, the price. Each vendor connection has a tariff attached to it, and this tariff is filled with rates for destinations that the vendor supports. We also collect xDRs for each vendor. These xDRs represent the amount that we owe to the vendor for all transactions with them. These records will help us ensure that the figures presented by the vendor at the end of the month match ours. If we receive an invoice for $10,000 from a vendor, we can compare it to our own statistics gathered in our system and inform the vendor that calls were only made for $3,000 according to our records. Okay? All customer activity is also represented by xDRs. Customer xDRs represent our revenue, the money that we charge our customers for the services that we provide. For each revenue xDR, there must be another xDR corresponding to the vendor costs. A business model in which we get revenue without any costs is, of course, not viable. So there must be records both about the revenue and the costs in the system. Nevertheless, in some situations, the cost of the service may be zero. One example of such calls at zero cost would be our customers calling each other using SIP phones connected to the PortaSwitch. There are no direct costs involved in this case, but we still need to create a record about this in the system. For this purpose, we are going to create an internal vendor and set the cost to zero. Each time an intra-network call is made, we're going to be able to trace the cost, even though it's nothing. This helps the operator avoid situations when the calls seem to be profitable at first, but in a couple of months, the operator realizes that they have been actually losing money instead of making a profit. What kind of vendors are there in PortaSwitch system? There are vendors that allow sending outgoing calls for termination. So they're connecting the PortaSwitch to the real phone network. There are also vendors that provide DID numbers to resell to our customers for incoming calls. There are vendors that provide SMS service, and special vendors like the internal vendor that represents a SIP-to-SIP connection for the situations when the calls are made within the framework of the PortaSwitch itself. For each vendor, we keep the following records. As I have already mentioned, we keep the list of all xDRs. We also keep quality reports or the average vendor success rate. It is very important whether a vendor provides good quality to our customers or not. For example, if we send 1 million calls to our vendor A, but only 10,000 calls are successfully terminated, it means that this vendor is not a reliable one, and we should not keep them on as a partner. Average success rate for such vendor would be really low. We also build cost revenue reports to make sure we stay profitable. We check the revenue for each particular vendor against the costs, and this gives us a possibility to decide whether its profitability holds up to our standards. The profitability of a vendor may depend on a particular destination. We may lose money, for example, when we send calls to Canada through vendor A. However, if we use the same vendor for termination of calls to Czech Republic, this may result very profitable for us. The main properties of a vendor are Of course, the name, then the balance. The balance is how much we owe the vendor in case the vendor only provides services to us. But sometimes a vendor can be both our provider and our customer. For example, vendor A provides a connection to South Africa and buys the termination of calls to Ukraine. In this case, we will link our vendor entity to the corresponding customer entity. And we have connections. Connection is the main property of a vendor. This is how we connect to their network. After that, we have authorization rules and credentials. Okay, this is it for the properties. Now let's go to our web interface and create a test vendor. Let's go to Infrastructure, Vendors, Create. Let's give our vendor a name. Let's call them Test Carrier. The currency is going to be US dollar. The opening balance is going to be 0. The vendor's balance shows us how much the owner of the PortaSwitch has to pay the vendor. Right now we don't owe our vendor anything. And the billing period is going to be monthly. Let's click Save. The next step is to set up the interaction parameters for this vendor. We are going to need to create an entity called connection. But first, let's talk about what a connection is.